Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. With the publication of The Sanatorium last year, Sarah Pearse had one of the most stunning crime fiction debuts in recent memory. It was an instant New York Times and international bestseller, as well as a Reese's Book Club selection, and a critical success. Detective Elin Warner is back in Sarah Pearse's second novel, The Retreat, another locked room-style thriller where she makes the setting, an island off the English coast, come alive, along with Reaper's Rock, a very ominous cliff face that's nearly a character itself. Sarah Pearse grew up in Devon, England, and studied English literature and creative writing at the University of Warwick before completing a postgraduate diploma in broadcast journalism. Her latest novel is The Retreat. It is published by Viking, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Sarah Pearse to this week's book show. Sarah, thank you very much for being with us. A delight to have you on the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Let us talk for a moment, just a moment, about coming out of such success of the first book and going into writing the second book, of what that was like for you.
Oh, yeah, it's such a good question, actually. And it's something I was really, really glad about was actually I was started writing this second book before any of the success happened with the Sanatorium, which I think was a blessed relief in a way. I guess it's that dreaded second album syndrome people talk about with the musicians.
Right.
So I'd actually had the idea for the book. And yeah, it's something I'd always wanted to sort of write about. It was an island that sort of based on one actually quite close to me. So I was already sort of well immersed. But yeah, it was the best start, I suppose, to my sort of debut I could have ever wished for, something I'd never even dreamt of. So I guess I had a sort of great motivation in terms of sort of finishing this second book. Yeah, it spurred me along, knowing that there were sort of readers, I suppose, waiting for the next installment.
What do you think it was about that book that struck readers?
People have sort of fed back a combination of things. And one thing I think people are sort of interested in actually is around the sort of where we were in the pandemic, I suppose, at the time. The themes in the book, that sort of locked room setting, the isolation, I think it tapped into a few things, I suppose, as a society, both in the US and in the UK, that we were kind of all experiencing. And I think that sense of isolation the characters feel sort of both personally and for Ellen professionally, perhaps tied in with that. And I think also the setting in itself, that perhaps clinical environment, that kind of tied in with sort of people's thoughts. And yeah, I suppose the sanatorium itself as a building is something quite unusual. I had a lot of people saying, you know, the idea that the building became a character in its own right was something people found quite exciting. And I know it led people off on quite a sort of few Google searches and sort of Reddit threads, finding out more about sanatoria. So yeah, I think it was a sort of combination of things. But yeah, definitely as well, obviously the Reese news was a sort of huge platform for me, and I'll always be grateful.
Before you knew what was coming, you start writing this book, The Retreat, the second novel, and it is another locked room style thriller. It is very different, and yet it still does sort of replicate that isolation, that lockdown that so many of us went through.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually was on my UK book tour this week, and someone had sort of asked me saying, do you think the pandemic and actually the reality of what happened will ever play out in your fiction? And I said, I don't know. It's still too raw at the moment. And I don't know whether I'd ever write a book that's specifically kind of pandemic fiction. But I think while writing the book, definitely what we're experiencing, because I was at home in lockdown, I think it definitely kind of tied into the book. And I think probably subconsciously, lots of elements of the emotions and experiences we had in lockdown sort of wove their way into The Retreat.
With that said, tell us about the main character, Elin Warner. And this is obviously for both books. We read more about her, of course, in The Retreat. But the evolution of this character, the birth of this character in your mind, what you wanted her to be and what she has become over these two novels.
Ellen, I suppose, in the Sanatorium, and just to sort of say, if you haven't read the Sanatorium, you can definitely kind of go into The Retreat as a standalone. And I think Ellen as a character, we kind of explain a little bit about her background there. But yeah, in the Sanatorium, we meet her, I suppose, quite an unusual point for a detective in a novel, where she's on a career break. So she's, I suppose, at both a sort of personal and professional crossroads. Lots of kind of questions in her mind, lots of worries whether she'll ever go back to her work as a detective. And we see her sort of of journey, I suppose, in the sanatorium through that. She was obviously dealing with a case there. But yeah, personally, she's kind of got questions over her brother's death that have played on her mind and sort of link into some of the sort of themes in the book. And in the retreat, she has made the decision to go back to work, but she's kind of working on secondment. I suppose you describe it as sort of a desk job. When this sort of case appears on the island, she's sort of nervous. Should she go? Shouldn't she? She decides to go. It's meant to be quite a straightforward case for her on her return. It looks like it's going to be a fall, an accident from the yoga pavilion onto the rocks below. But yeah, she soon finds out it's anything but. And I think we see a sort of stronger Elin in this book. She has a partner to work off Steed, which is slightly different from the sanatorium. And we see her, I suppose, trying to draw on her own reserves rather than getting strength from the people around her, which is quite new. But yeah, she's a vulnerable character in some ways. I think she's not afraid to sort of put those feelings and emotions out there. And I think those are feelings and emotions everyone in any role will probably feel. Only enhanced more as a detective.
It's fascinating as that vulnerability starts to erode, right? That she realizes, she starts to gain more confidence and realize what she's doing is not only the right thing, but is getting her to where she wants to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea that kind of being in touch with your emotions and sort of confronting the past, I think we see Elin in the first book has sort of tried to put a lid on all of that. And I think one thing I'm kind of keen in both books to peel back is the idea that can you suppress the past? Can you suppress kind of what you've gone through personally? And that's echoed out in kind of the buildings and their past and the island's past. Or will that kind of past always bubble up to the surface? And I think with Elin, she's very much tried to suppress it in the sanatorium and sort of dealt with it. And I think in the retreat, we see her kind of moving on, using that past as a strength and realizing, I suppose, that these vulnerabilities, this awareness, I suppose, she has of other people's feelings and emotions, her awareness of her feelings actually can be a strength. And I think she uses those strengths within the retreat to sort of help her solve the case and I suppose move on as a person.
Sarah Pearse is our guest. The new book is The Retreat. Well, one of the things that fascinated me about both of these books, but especially The Retreat, and I realized you front load the book with a lot of character information of going back and forth to two groups of characters and giving us a lot of information that we sort of take in, but we don't know what to make of it. And we're sort of, okay, why, what was Elin? Who is this now? And you sort of go back and forth. And then all of a sudden you get hit with the crime and then everything starts to fit into place. I find that a very cool way of sort of, as I said, front loading it to the point where you have this information. You may not know that you have this information, but you do have this information.
Absolutely. I suppose one of my pleasures, and I did something a little bit different with this book, in the sanatorium, we very much have Elin as a main character and we have different points of views. But yeah, only very briefly. In this book, we have Elin and we also have the character of Hannah, who has come to the island as part of a sort of family group. And there, as you say, there's sort of a lot of front loading of information. And I think I enjoy when I do have different points of view, really working out where those kind of points of view converge, I suppose. And we quite quickly see that Elin has called to the island. There's an accident. We see the family group, sort of someone within that family group is potentially a victim. And yeah, a lot of that sort of front loading is setting the scene, I suppose, for what's going on. And I think one thing I was really interested in this book is exploring the sort of relationship and dynamics between people. And again, with Elin and Will, her partner, and Will's sister, who is working on the island, there's a lot of that information that needs to be set up at the beginning for the reader to really have that aha moment, which I think they do as you work their way through the book. So lots of the things that we see being set up, the threads that are kind of being interwoven, all come into play. And that's something I love in books. So I really wanted to explore in this one.
And it's wonderful how you do it. Well, just how messy families are and how much is spoken, how much is unspoken, and especially with Hannah's character of the different relationships that siblings have with one another.
Yeah. One of the things I love about sort of families, I suppose, and I'm just really interested in is how much you kind of ever know the people around you. And I think in a family group, particularly with siblings, I think it's really interesting when you're younger and you live in close confines with someone in the same house, you believe you have sort of an intimacy on a level you'll never know sort of anyone else again. And then as you kind of grow up and you don't no longer have that geographical, physical intimacy, perhaps you wonder, did I ever really know that person at all?
Right.
And certainly kind of, do I know them now? And I think we had it with Elin and Isaac, her brother, in the first book. And in this family group, we really do see those sort of secrets and lies. And I suppose almost what I suppose is suppression of emotion you get within families, where people are feeling things but are scared to say. You have kind of that sibling order. And I think with Hannah, you have that as a child. Are you the middle one? Are you the older one? Are you the bossy one, the sporty one? And I think we see in the book, it kind of plays out that you sort of almost stay within those assigned roles.
Mm.
And I think Hannah in the book is quite frustrated with her role, I suppose, as the moderator between the extremes of her two sisters. And you see that sort of simmering away and bubbling, that frustration of things she's kind of wanted to let out for a while. And I think we kind of see that breaking point, which was very fun as a writer to explore. And yeah, all of those frustrated feelings in that sibling group emerging in one explosion.
So in that particular group of characters, you have the three sisters and their cousin. Is there a process you have for developing them, of making them as nuanced and as deep and layered as they become?
Yeah, definitely. For me, I really love exploring. And I think sort of what you mentioned at the beginning about sort of front loading with information, I suppose that was only almost the tip of the iceberg. It may not seem that way, but I spend a lot of time thinking about the sort of dynamics between the characters. And what would suppose I had Hannah as a character first, and that sort of almost put upon sibling. And I had a lot of fun exploring how she got to that place, what the relationship between the siblings were like, how it had evolved. And then, yeah, interestingly, with Maya, who's the cousin, she was kind of very much including in their sort of almost sibling group after an accident with another sort of sibling in the family. And yeah, she has her own sort of feelings and dynamics. And again, there was sort of a childhood promise we mentioned at the beginning of the book to kind of stick together. And that hasn't happened. And yeah, I just thought I really need to sort of dig a little bit more into their backstories, and I kind of create sort of character arcs and fully fleshed outlines for each character. But yeah, lots of which don't make it into the book.
When it comes to the reveals, when it comes to the moments of the twists, how apparent are those in your mind that, okay, this is where this needs to happen? Or do you play with it in the sense of, oh, maybe this would be better here, or maybe this would be better a few pages down the road?
Yeah, it's definitely a sense of playing with it, I suppose. I think I have an idea, definitely when I'm plotting, of where things need to happen. But often as the sort of writing process evolves, and I suppose you almost have new things that emerge, things do kind of get shifted around. But with writing a thriller, I like to sort of know where those key moments happen, but they definitely can kind of shift chapter to chapter, and evolve as that sort of writing process goes on.
We mentioned sort of this book was coming along as the other book was hitting the world, and you were getting feedback, right? I mean, you were talking to readers, they were writing to you, you were communicating with them, and does that clear things up for you, or does that muddy the waters?
That's such a good question, because it's really quite tricky when you're kind of communicating with readers, as you say, sort of about the current book and thoughts of that, and kind of people have ideas. It sort of does both, I think you kind of really quickly learn what readers do and don't like about the characters and the plot. But yeah, I think you kind of have to sort of stay clear to what you were planning to write in the first place, I suppose. But yeah, I love sort of getting the feedback from readers and hearing what they think. But yeah, it's hard not to be a little bit swayed by what people are thinking. So yeah, I kind of had to sort of stay on a straight course.
The idea of the police procedural and of looking at how you wanted to attack or to address this type of novel and this genre, if you will. Obviously, there are many ways of doing it, and of choosing Elin and going about it the way that you do, and the type of character that Elin is, of someone who is very strong, but certainly has her concerns, and there is vulnerability there. Of how you decide that is not only going to be a fundamental part of this character, but it's something that you can work with down the line in writing however many books you end up writing about this character.
Yeah, I think having a character that feels quite real was really important to me. And I think genuinely, as any sort of person, if sort of looks across their life, you are definitely going on a journey. And I think having Elin as a sort of emotionally raw and vulnerable character, I thought was quite interesting to play with. It isn't something I had sort of seen in fiction. I think a lot of sort of female detectives have tended to be almost, I suppose, what's quite traditionally masculine in how they're portrayed or narrated. And I think in the book, showing Ellen's feelings about not just sort of her personal life, but her professional life, and being raw in that way was something really interesting. And I think in the retreat, we definitely sort of see a step change. And then obviously I'm writing the third book now. We see her behaviour evolve again. And I think personally, sort of someone who is quite vulnerable is something we can all tap into as people. I think we all have sort of insecurities, perhaps imposter syndrome about what we do in a professional world and possibly even in a personal world. And I think she's quite messy, quite clumsy, not only professionally, but with sort of the people around her sometimes. And yeah, I was really interested to see where that could take me as the books progress. And I think hopefully the readers will go on that sort of journey with Elin through the books.
And there has to be those character or those characters that do trust Elin, right? That trust your protagonist, that help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in this book, we see the character of Steed, and she very much, who's a sort of a police colleague with her, and her boss, Anna, who has faith in her at the beginning. I think there's an element of Elin that's really tough on herself. And again, I think that's something I suppose we can all relate to. I think she's sort of hyper-analyzes her feelings sometimes. And as a reader, we're sort of privy to those things that other people might not see. But I actually think she's, as we see in this book, a pretty competent detective. It's more about sort of getting her confidence in herself back. And I think she sort of is plagued by sort of riddled with these doubts and insecurities. And I think kind of case by case, and as we see here, we see sort of that journey back to strength. We haven't seen sort of Elin prior to her career break, but she was a competent detective. And she's, as I say, sort of a bit of a crossroads in the sanatorium. But yeah, we kind of see her progress. And I think the characters around her have that trust in her as well. But definitely, like all of us, I think we need to have those people surrounding us that believe in us.
I know you wrote a lot of short fiction initially. What was it that brought you to want to write this type of book, to write a mystery and to write a series even?
I really personally love mystery thrillers. It's something I suppose from a child. I kind of live in the area where Agatha Christie grew up, and I suppose we were always saturated with the idea of sort of Agatha Christie as a mystery writer. And it's something I suppose in all of my fiction I read as a child, I loved anything with a sense of adventure, suspense, that kind of thrill. But yeah, I started off writing short fiction. I suppose it wasn't until I read the initial article about the Sanatorium and the legacy of Sanatorium in the Alps that I got really, really excited by the idea of writing a sort of, I suppose, atmospheric thriller that really played on the landscape. Elin as a character I'd had kind of in several sort of, I suppose, pieces of short fiction or ideas. And I thought, marry the two together. We have Elin, this character, we have this dramatic landscape, and it led itself to a crime thriller. And I think I knew as soon as I started writing, I'd sort of found the right combination of character and setting, which was a very exciting moment.
I would think I've read many comparisons of your work to that of Agatha Christie. I don't know if I were you, how much of that I would allow in.
No, exactly. You can't. It's really interesting when people compare someone's work to another author, isn't it? Because like you say, it's kind of how much do you kind of absorb that? I think our work is hugely different. I suppose the only thing I would say probably we have in common is the idea of the sort of detective in perhaps quite exotic locations.
Right. Well, and that's it. You think of like Murder on the Orient Express. It's these characters on this train, and it is finite. It isn't infinite. It's not a city full of people. It's who's on that train. And with you, it's who's in that sanatorium, who's at that retreat, and that is mix, stir, and enjoy at that point. And in that, because of that finite element, your mind can't go too crazy as to what happens, and yet you're still surprised and stunned, which is why I think there is the comparison made.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of locked room or closed circle, I know there's lots of sort of differences between the definitions of the two, but yeah, something she does so cleverly in the work is I think you always plausibly believe that it could be any character. But as you say, there's a smaller group, but equally we're shocked when we find out why. And I
Right.
think that sort of comes back to giving those characters good backstories, good motivations for sort of committing the crime. And I think as an author, it's sort of quite an intellectual challenge, quite an academic puzzle in a way, to kind of make sure that it could be anyone and to plant those seeds. And I think with Agatha Christie, one thing she does, which I love or am attempting to do in my work, is sort of really misdirect the reader. You're planting those clues, really making the reader believe the victim could be someone else, for example, or their motivation is really could be one character, and the reader is believing, yes, it's definitely that person. And then at the last minute, that's thrown on its head. So yeah, there's definitely comparisons there. I think as an author, that sort of idea of a limited pool of suspects is a challenge, but equally very exciting because you really have to think about the why, which I love.
Absolutely. I think your use of the words academic puzzle is fascinating. It does become that, right? I mean, you have to think of it in that sense, and the challenge of creating the puzzle, but then also solving the puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really tricky thing, actually. You have the kind of two sides, as you say. Not as a reader, I suppose you're sort of on the course of solving it, but as the author, you are doing both of that. As you say, you're creating the puzzle, planting the seeds, and then kind of solving it as the sort of book goes on. But yeah, it's a great exercise to do, and I think there's a lot of, once you've sort of got that plot worked out, there's a lot of sort of, which I describe as the fun bit, kind of going in and planting the clues and the sort of seeds for misdirection later on. And yeah, it's a really sort of fun puzzle to have. So yeah, I hope the readers enjoy it as much as I do.
Well, certainly it is. It's very enjoyable to read. What type of things, as you were talking about a moment ago, I mentioned the short fiction, and then you said that this was always the type of book that you enjoyed. What was it that you think grabbed you of wanting not only to read it, but to try your hand at it as well?
I personally, I think, I suppose, probably for any author, their love of sort of wanting to try something is enjoying reading books yourselves, and I suppose having a go at what other authors were doing. And I think I personally, for me, the motivation, I suppose, was always having, giving a reader pleasure, having a reader say, I love that book. I'd love to read another one sort of by that author. And I think sort of the thrill and challenge of mystery books and kind of creating that atmosphere and suspense, as well as the sort of puzzle aspect of it, is a challenge. And I personally love a challenge. I think there were so many sort of elements that came into play in the book that sort of challenged me as an author, both in terms of my voice, both in terms of my plotting. I feel a mystery sort of pulls a lot of things together from a plot point of view, from a character point of view, from setting. And yeah, I knew it was the genre I wanted to write in.
You knew it was the genre that you wanted to write in. Did you know at the beginning, as you started writing the Sanatorium, that you wanted it to be a series, that it would be something that you would, that was the goal, that you would hope to continue the story of Ellen?
Yeah, definitely. When Ellen, sort of, we meet Ellen as a character, she's very sort of, I suppose, unformed in a way. There's lots we know about her. Lots of people describe her in the Sanatorium as an unreliable narrator in some ways. And that was definitely the case to a degree. And I knew I wanted to sort of follow her on this journey. But also, I suppose, in the book, we have sort of threads that we carry between books 1 and 2. It's not essential to have read book 1 to sort of pick up on that in book 2. But yeah, I knew that definitely there were 3 books that I wanted to follow through. We have this idea of a character kind of following Ellen, and we don't know why. And I love the idea personally that as a reader, we're getting to know Ellen, but there are still parts of her we don't quite know. And in book 3, we kind of see that sort of, yeah, very much revealed as to why. And it tells us a lot more about Ellen as a person, actually. So yeah, I wanted that sort of story to continue and Ellen to continue, I suppose.
And Sarah, when you say that elements that we don't quite know, I assume you mean us, the readers. Do you know?
Yes, yeah. Not everything though. It's a really good question, because I think as a writer, you definitely, I've got to know that character, and in the second book, I've got to know her more.
Right.
But there are still things in writing the book that you don't know, and I have to say, as I'm writing book 3, I'm sure there will be elements about her as a person that I find out through her interaction with other characters. For example, I'm always surprised by some of the things she does as I'm writing. She might be in a scene with someone, and the conversation evolves, and I get to know her a little bit more. And I think that, lots of people ask in a series, does it get boring writing the same character? For me, definitely not. I think you can kind of very much deepen your knowledge of the character as you're writing her. I do have ideas of where she wants to go and what she's doing in a book, but there's always more to explore, which is fun.
I would think it would be. One of the things in talking to many mystery thriller writers that they are always fascinated by is and you touched on this earlier about during the pandemic, but the relationship that you have with the readers. This is a very, very fervent fan base, right? I mean, these are people that take this very, very seriously. So God forbid you screw it up.
Yeah, exactly. That's the trouble. And I have to say, lots of the things about the police procedure, for example, lots of people who sort of invest not only, I suppose, in the characters in your books, but invest in the genre. There's lots of things you need to get right as an author. So that's why I make sure I do my research, and I make sure, I suppose, I sort of do the acid test with each character. Are they behaving in character? Would this work for the reader? But yeah, as you say, an avid fan base, and you have to make sure you get things right.
Do you worry about too much violence, too much language? Because your books seem to be appropriate for many audiences, and I was just wondering if that was a conscious decision.
It really was, actually. And I think a few people have said this in terms of sort of the use of language, for example, as in it could be read potentially by younger people. And the violence, I suppose it stems a little bit from what I personally like to read. I like things which have an element of using your imagination. So it takes you to a point, I suppose, but you can sort of almost pull back from there. And it's, I suppose, as far as your imagination wants to take you. So I know I've had lots of people sort of saying, their imagination took them to very dark places and they found it veering more on the horror. But I think when you view the book objectively, it does take you to those places, but you can pull back from it. And I think definitely in terms of language and things as well, I wanted my book to be read by as many people as possible. And I don't think you always necessarily need to sort of push the envelope that much in order to get the same effect. I think suggestion's often more powerful than actually anything too overt.
And do you think that force, if you will, could be screwed around with if you put it onto a small or large screen?
Yeah, that's something I always struggle with, actually, because I love watching sort of adaptations. And I think it's always interesting to see sort of how that element of suggestion is lost. There's a ghost story, actually, by Sarah Waters that was put onto the big screen a little while ago, The Little Stranger. And I do think some of those aspects that your imagination takes over is lost on screen. I think you world build when you read a book, don't you? You're kind of creating that world inside your head and letting it. But I think you've just become something slightly more passive with film. And yeah, I think you lose the subtleties in some ways. Don't get me wrong, I think film as a genre is able to do so many things. But yeah, I think the transition from book to film in particular can be, I suppose, troublesome in that aspect. I don't think you are able to pull back in the same way, no.
Sarah Pearse's new novel is The Retreat. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark